When I entered seminary, I took a course on Unitarian Universalist history and wrote a paper on the Unitarian response to Nazi Germany in the 1930s. My research revealed much division during that time on the issue of pacifism. Those advocating absolute pacifism, led by John Hayes Holmes of the Community Church in New York City, were challenged by ministers such as James Luther Adams, who had traveled in Nazi Germany and foresaw the horrors to come. Many Unitarians straddled the fence, eventually supporting the effort once the European conflict erupted, and more strongly after Pearl Harbor. I found myself sympathetic to what I called realistic pacifists, who abhorred war, but recognized the necessity of the practice under certain circumstances. And yet, throughout this journey, my doubts grew. I lived through the Gulf War and then our invasion of Iraq. I saw just war theory brutalized by those with financial motivations or historic biases against the Muslim people. I read more history, now revealing even more complicity by the United States in the birth and growth of Nazism in Germany and the hatred of America by the Japanese. I began to see more clearly the attitude of Gandhi and Jesus, that violence only propagates more violence, continuing that cycle of humans harming one another. This brings me back to the latest landmark on my particular road. One day I entered the room of a patient. Somehow in that half hour we shared, he decided to share with me his experiences in Vietnam. Now I believe sometimes random events or people can come together in some larger meaning, but that there need not be any identifiable cause for the meeting. What this man had been feeling for 40 years came flowing out with me. Now, during CPE, students spend time in clinical sites, in small groups processing exercises, and in more traditional learning sessions called didactics. Just the day before, my group learned about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, during a didactic. This man exhibited every symptom, many of which I had seen my brother John display. He had been exposed to traumatic events during the war. He re-experienced these events in flashbacks and nightmares. He had never been able to talk about these things, even related to the experience that would trigger these memories. He experienced persistent difficulty with sleep, with anger, and with being hypervigilant, that is, sensitive to things like loud noises. And he had experienced these symptoms for years, and they significantly impaired his ability to function in social and in work settings. As we spoke, I shared my feelings about my brother and the stories John had shared with me. He then told his own stories, including one about a Vietnamese girl who used to come into the soldiers' PX. He said that the soldiers bought her whatever she wanted because she was so pretty and innocent. He went on to tell me that one day he picked her up and she exploded. She had been booby-trapped. he began to cry, and I joined him. His tears frustrated him, but I told him what I had learned the day before. You have been through a traumatic experience. Crying is the reaction any normal person should have when faced with such an abnormal time in one's life. These tears have waited 40 years to come out of you. Afterwards, I reflected on this visit and felt incredible sadness for this man. I could only imagine the tragedy of his life for the past 4 decades. I reflected on my brother's continuing struggle with his own PTSD symptoms and realized fully, for the first time, that the victims of war include not only the dead, the wounded, the imprisoned and the displaced, but all of the soldiers engaged in the conflict, their families, their friends, and everyone whose lives they touch. I realized that no cause, no reasons, no justifications could warrant the destruction of war. The destruction that war had caused this man for the past 40 years. And I knew that we will continue to devastate the lives of men and women like this until we end war, until we disavow all violence toward one another, until we pledge, once and for all, not to harm each other. Therefore, I have pledged to live the rest of my life nonviolently. I will militantly defend the rights of the innocent with my own life, if needed. But I will strive never again to harm another person mentally, physically, or emotionally. I make the distinction set forth by John Haynes Holmes in his 1916 book, New Wars for Old, in that I will lift up my militancy from the plane of the physical to the plane of moral and spiritual force. As a human being, I will struggle to maintain this pledge. As a human being, I recognize that I will harm others. But as a human being, I know that I have the potential to end war. We have the potential to love each other, and we have the duty to try to live nonviolently. The cycle of people harming one another cannot stop until enough of us pledge to end our violent behaviors.